Oh, I think there's some on the podium, no?
Good evening. Welcome to the second annual Spriggs Family Lecture, funded by the Spriggs Family Endowment for Free Market Studies here at Boise State and sponsored by the College of Business and Economics. My name is Alan Dalton. I'm an emeritus faculty in the economics department and the organizer for tonight's lecture. Before thanking some attendees and introducing tonight's speaker, I'd like to make sure everyone's turned these things off. So if you're not sure, check now, please. Another couple of items. At the conclusion of the lecture, members of the economics department, students in the economics department, will have mics like this one, and they'll be running around so that you can ask questions. Okay, so just raise your hand. They'll spot you. They'll try to keep you in the order that you've raised your hand. Okay, and that way you don't have to wander around too far to find a mic. Secondly, for those students who are getting extra credit for tonight, pass in those slips at the conclusion when we leave. Okay. The Spriggs Family Endowment for Free Market Studies was created in 2020 from a generous donation by the family of Scott and Lynette Spriggs to Boise State's College of Business and Economics. The purpose of the endowment is to fund a yearly lecture bringing a prominent researcher and teacher to Boise to discuss the nature, attributes, and outcomes of market processes. Scott and Lynette were originally planning on being here tonight, but their first grandchild was born on Friday, and they understandably changed plans. Nevertheless, they will be viewing the recording of this, so let's all give them a round of applause. I'd also like to recognize Dean Mark Bannister of the College of Business and Economics, whose vision and leadership helps make events like this possible for Boise State students and citizens of Boise and the Treasure Valley. Mark, right there. Tonight's speaker is Peter Klein, the W. Caruth Endowed Chair and Professor of Entrepreneurship at Baylor University. He is chairman of the Department of Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation at the Hankamer School of Business, and he's also the director of the Baugh Center for, presumably Sammy Baugh? No? You don't know? Okay, Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. He also serves as an adjunct professor of strategy and management at the Norwegian School of Economics and is the Carl Menger Research Fellow at the Mises Institute. Klein is one of the leading researchers at the intersection of entrepreneurship, strategy, and organization. He applies economic theories and research methods to key issues about the emergence, boundaries, and internal organization of business firms, how individuals and groups engage in entrepreneurial and innovative activity, and the ways organizations structure themselves to create and capture value. Klein has authored or co-authored over 70 refereed journal articles, appearing in leading economics and management journals. He is the author of 3 books. In 2012, his book, Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgment, which he co-wrote with Nikolai Foss, won the Foundation for Economic Education Best Book Prize and that book has been translated into Chinese, Polish, and Persian. His 2010 book, The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur, has been translated into Chinese and Portuguese, and his newest book, Why Managers Matter, The Perils of the Bossless Company, also co-written with Nikolai Foss, appeared in 2022. He received his PhD in economics from Cal Berkeley in 1995 and his BA in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1988. He has held faculty positions at the University of Missouri, the Copenhagen Business School, the University of Georgia, and Washington University in St. Louis. Basically, you can't keep a job. He was senior economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors in 2000-2001. That's Clinton and George W. Bush that he served on both of their councils. He holds an honorary professorship in the Beijing University of Information Science and Technology, and tonight's lecture concerns the contributions of entrepreneurs and managers to a prosperous economy. Why entrepreneurs and managers matter. Please join me in welcoming Peter Klein.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Dalton, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you tonight. This is my first trip to Boise. I think it's my first time in Idaho, actually, even though I have eaten a lot of potatoes in my life. And I did get the tour of town and the tour of campus with all the obligatory stops, including the football field, of course. And I heard the story of how it came to have its unique character. And I was really intrigued by the idea. I mean, once you think about it, it makes perfect sense. There's no reason why an artificial turf field has to be green, right? It could be any color you want. And I think I'm going to take this idea back to my own university and suggest that they paint the field in our school colors as well. Our school colors are green and gold, so I'm going to suggest they paint the AstroTurf green to show that we're as unique as Boise. That would be a very entrepreneurial thing to do, wouldn't it? So I want to talk to you tonight about entrepreneurship, what entrepreneurship is, different ways to think about entrepreneurship and the role that it performs in society, and also the relationship between entrepreneurs and managers, because we may perceive a tension right between the idea person, the innovator, the creative, dynamic individual, and the bureaucrat, right, the overseer, the executive, and even worse, the middle manager, whom we might think is sort of working against the interests of the creative and dynamic entrepreneur. I want to give you some ways to think about that tension with reference to some things that I've been working on in recent years. So as Professor Dalton indicated, I did my training in economics. I was always very interested in entrepreneurship as a phenomenon. And as I began to change my research portfolio or shift more in the direction of studying entrepreneurship and innovation, I began to engage more deeply with not only the academic entrepreneurship literature, but also the practitioner literature and student programs. I know you have courses here at Boise, students in entrepreneurship. We have a whole bunch of them at Baylor. We have a whole major. You can major in entrepreneurship. You can minor in entrepreneurship. We have a separate academic department. You can even get a PhD in entrepreneurship studies. And I think that partly reflects the fact that entrepreneurship is so much more, it's so much more interesting, or it gets so much more attention now than it did, when I was a student. We didn't have entrepreneurship courses at the university when I was your age, but it really has been something that's taken off in a lot of different realms. If you ask kids, who is your favorite celebrity, or who do you want to be when you grow up, right? Of course, it might be athletes, entertainers, and so forth. But everybody knows who Steve Jobs is. Everybody knows why Steve Jobs is famous. Everybody knows his black turtleneck signature look, right? That was not true of technology executives in the past. Whether it's Richard Branson or Dr. Dre or whoever. Entrepreneurship is much more part of our popular culture today than it was in the past. If I could just make a little reference that only the older people in the room will understand. Back when I was in high school, everybody wanted to be the next Jimmy Page. Do you guys know who Jimmy Page is? Young folks, he was the lead guitarist for Led Zeppelin, and all the old guys are like, yeah. Nowadays, kids want to be Larry Page, okay, who was the co-founder of Google. So it's kind of like a revenge of the nerds thing, right? Entrepreneur nerds are cool. We all know who they are. We know their stories. We want to be like them. Why is entrepreneurship such a hot topic? Why do people care about it? Why is it in the news? Why is it in the media? I mean, there are a variety of different reasons, some of them sort of internal, some of them external. For example, I think there's a greater recognition now that the lifestyle of the entrepreneur might be attractive. Students think, well, I don't want to work for a big company. I want to start my own company. I want to run my own business because I want to be my own man or woman. I like the autonomy and independence that comes with being an entrepreneur. A lot of entrepreneurship, obviously not all, is associated with technology. You can be a great entrepreneur in agriculture or transportation or food services or hospitality or whatever, but there's probably a tech aspect to that as well. But the entrepreneurs that we tend to idolize, the Steve Jobses and people like that, are often in the technology sector. That attracts a lot of people. Obviously, the sort of media attention. We've all seen Shark Tank on TV, and we have a sense of how all that process works. It's interesting, it's entertaining. But I think, from an academic perspective, there are also reasons why scholars are paying more attention to entrepreneurship than they did before. Right, so some of it, may be a belief, I think it's a correct belief, but a belief that the sorts of phenomena that we associate with entrepreneurship, right? Startup companies and tech companies and patenting and venture capital and IPOs and so forth, that these are much more important to our economy and society than maybe they were in the past. We might think, oh, the old economy was about steel and cars and these sort of old industries, and the new economy is about knowledge, right, and innovation. And so if we think those things are more important in determining growth and societal well-being, well, we certainly ought to study them and try to understand them, figure out where they come from. I think there's also a sense within our, within certain scientific fields, that maybe the way we try to study some of these phenomena is too sterile, it's too narrow. This is, an inside reference for you economics majors, of which I know we have many in the room. All these sort of formal mathematical models that emphasize finding the equilibrium, solving for the equilibrium state. You hear many researchers say, gosh, maybe, these sort of equilibrium-based formal mathematical models do not give us insight into, someone like Steve Jobs, right? It doesn't help us to understand Apple. It doesn't help us to understand technological change. Maybe we need new theories, new models, new techniques, new frameworks that sort of build entrepreneurship and creativity and innovation in from the start. So in economics and management and other disciplines, maybe we want to have an entrepreneurial understanding of the labor market or an entrepreneurial understanding of the automobile industry or whatever it might be. Okay, so all these different things are sort of pulling us to pay more attention to entrepreneurship and innovation. But what is it? What is entrepreneurship? What is an entrepreneur? If I just say the word entrepreneur, the first thing that comes to your mind might be a small business owner. Somebody who started and operates a coffee shop or a restaurant or a dry cleaning shop or has a storefront on Etsy, sells stuff on eBay, whatever. Okay, so that's one kind of entrepreneur. We often think of more the techie kind of entrepreneur, right? Not just someone who runs a small business, but someone who starts a small business that will eventually become large, right? What will be the next billion-dollar company? That's what the sharks the Shark Tank folks are looking for, not the next restaurant or the next dry cleaning shop, but what will be the next Google, the next Apple, the next Tesla, et cetera. Now, you might also think of entrepreneurship as a way for people who are shut out of conventional employment channels to earn a living. So those of you, if you've traveled, on study abroad or something, if you've been to emerging markets, you're familiar with the phenomenon of the roadside fruit stand, or you stop at a red light and kids come up to you trying to sell you stuff. In the literature, they sometimes refer to this as necessity entrepreneurship, as opposed to opportunity entrepreneurship. It's like there's an old joke, right? The one guy says to his friend, "Hey, so what made you decide to become an entrepreneur?" The guy says, "Well, something my boss said to me one day." "Really, what's that?" "You're fired." Okay, so maybe people pursue entrepreneurship because that's the best opportunity that they have, especially in conditions where the economy is not running very well. You do see an increased interest in sort of like, the foreign aid community, World Bank, USAID, whatever. How do we get low-income countries to grow faster, to increase their rate of economic growth? The answer used to be, well, they need big infrastructure projects. They need dams and electric plants, and we need to build roads and highways and so forth. Nowadays, if you talk to people at the World Bank, they'll say, what you need is more entrepreneurship. Starting from the very bottom, right? The roadside fruit stand that can then someday morph or turn into something that can employ more people, that can grow and so forth. Sometimes if I throw out the word entrepreneur, you think of the high-profile, charismatic, and maybe slightly not entirely sane individuals who create, companies that are quite radical. Well, didn't create, but who are running radical companies like Tesla, or I won't, we could talk all night about how Twitter has changed in the last few months. Those of you who are Twitter users, I think I'm a fan of what Elon is doing so far, but who knows? The whole thing may crash and burn any day now, because he seems like that kind of a guy. But my point is, the concept of entrepreneurship is really broad, right? It covers the coffee shop owner, Elon Musk, people in emerging markets. Well, what is it? Give me a definition, professor. It's not very helpful. Well, if you want to understand entrepreneurship better, if you want not only formal definitions, but some great explication and analysis, I can recommend some books. There's some really good books that you can read. I mean, here are two chosen completely at random that I think you may find interesting and enjoyable. They tell you everything you could want to know about entrepreneurship. I can recommend in particular the book on the left, the one with the blue cover. I can make a promise to you students that I don't make to everyone. It's really a guarantee that you will get at least your money's worth from that book. And the reason I can make that guarantee is because you can download the ebook for $0 for free at the Mises Institute website, mises.org, and I guarantee you will get at least $0 worth of benefit from reading the book. The one on the right is published by a Cambridge University Press, and it's like $25 or something. You probably will get $25 worth of value out of it too. One of the things that these books point out is that there are lots of different ways to think about what an entrepreneur is, what an entrepreneur does. One way that we often think about entrepreneurship is as a phenomenon or an outcome, right? Self-employment is one way of conceptualizing entrepreneurship, or new venture formation, new venture growth, or investments in innovation like R&D expenditures, patenting new products, and so forth. So one of the advantages of this notion of entrepreneurship is that it's something we can observe, right? You can collect data. If I say, hey, which is a more entrepreneurial state, Idaho, or what's a really unhappy state, Montana or something, right? And what you could do is you could compute the ratio of self-employed to total population, or self-employed to employed, or something like that. Come up with a self-employment rate. And you could say, in Idaho, the self-employment rate is higher than it is in Montana, therefore Idaho is a more entrepreneurial state. Or you could say Idaho has more technology ventures per capita, or more patents were filed in Idaho than in Montana, or whatever, right? We'd have some way of getting sort of an empirical sense of whether entrepreneurship is present or absent, if it's increasing, decreasing, et cetera. There's a problem with that, a number of problems with that approach. One is that in everyday language, we speak about being entrepreneurial as more like a personality type. You know what I mean? Like, oh, so-and-so, she's a real entrepreneur, by which we mean she's always, creating a new thing or thinking outside the box. I do this with my kids. I have teenagers at home, and, I'll be in my little study at home trying to work or whatever, and I'll hear this, this yelling from the other side of the house. Dad, you have to go to the grocery store. There's nothing to eat in the house. There is no food in the house. I mean, of course, the house is stocked with food, right? What my son means is, I want a ham and cheese sandwich in my mouth right now. You need to go out and get it. And what I will often say back is, no, I'm busy. Get off your, put down the controller, take off the headset and the controller, go into the kitchen, wander around, be entrepreneurial about it. I don't mean quit high school and start a tech company, right? What I mean is get off your butt and go in there and look around, exercise some initiative, figure it out. And lo and behold, there's, if you open the fridge, there's some ham in there, and there's some cheese over there, and in the cabinet there's some bread, and there's some mustard over there, and a knife, and a plate. And if you combine these elements with human labor, you can produce a sandwich, okay? But the thing with sort of your personality types and creative attributes is that they don't necessarily map exactly into self-employment, startups, R&D. Right? We might think that self-employed people, that people who start companies are very creative, that they show a lot of initiative and imagination. But, not necessarily so. You wouldn't look at Bill Gates and say, oh, he's a go-getter, right? He's like the ultimate nerd's nerd. Okay, so maybe personality is neither necessary nor sufficient to be successful as a commercial entrepreneur. But there's yet another way, a third way to think about entrepreneurship. And this is what you get if you study the classic texts. And who doesn't want to curl up with one of these 1,000-page tomes on a night like tonight when the snow's coming down in the fireplace, in front of the fireplace. My hotel room has a nice little fireplace. Isn't that lovely? If you look at the classic works from scholars such as Joseph Schumpeter, one of the great economists of the 20th century, or Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, or Israel Kirzner, a more recent scholar who's written quite a lot on entrepreneurship, you find that what they seem to be describing is not an empirical phenomenon, nor is it a psychological personality, but it's more of an abstract economic function. It's a function that is performed in the economy at different times and places by different individuals or groups. What is that function? Well, that function has been conceptualized in slightly different ways. Israel Kirzner, who's a more recent scholar, wrote a famous book in the 1970s where he described entrepreneurship as alertness to opportunities. And his idea was, if you imagine, walking down the street and there's like a $20 bill on the sidewalk, right? Kirzner says, well, a lot of people, will be walking down the street, especially, no offense, but Gen Zs, right, will be, because you guys walk in the praying mantis pose, right? This is how you walk. You walk right past the $20 bills, you never see it, and you just walk right by and not pick it up. But someone who is more aware of their surroundings, more situational awareness, might be alert to the fact that there's a $20 bill on the ground and will bend down and pick it up. So according to Kirzner, the money that entrepreneurs make, the money that Steve Jobs made from designing and producing and selling iPhones and creating the whole iOS ecosystem, et cetera, it's like a $20 bill on the sidewalk, or a $20 billion or $20 trillion bill on the sidewalk, meaning that there was an opportunity to take those physical inputs, the technology, the silicon, the plastic, the glass, and so forth, combine it with software, package it in a certain way, sell it at a certain price, create a whole new sort of market niche, revolutionize the mobile phone industry, and make a lot of money. Steve Jobs was the first to recognize that that could be done. He was more alert to that opportunity than, the people who are running the phone companies of the day, like BlackBerry or Nokia, that dominated the phone market before Apple came along. And in other words, if Steve Jobs hadn't figured it out, eventually somebody else would have come along and realized that you could do this. And of course now, Samsung and LG and Google and all kinds of companies make a device that is very similar to an iPhone. Another way to conceptualize entrepreneurship, the formulation from Joseph Schumpeter, the one I mentioned before, is to think of entrepreneurship as sort of novelty, or I wrote innovation on the slide, but a better word would be innovativeness. Doing new things. It doesn't have to be, innovation like R&D dollars in an accounting sense, but, finding a new way to do something, building a better mousetrap, taking existing resources and combining them in a new way to produce a new good or service, satisfy a new market need in a way that no one had ever thought of before. And there's some similarities, but also some tensions between those two different views. The view of the entrepreneurial function that I have elaborated on and sort of embraced in my own research is one that comes from the American economist Frank Knight and the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, who I mentioned before. That's the notion of entrepreneurship as judgment under uncertainty. Judgment under uncertainty. I put, the ... like there are other less smart people who have also, supported this view. But here the idea is, maybe some of you have studied in class, especially if you've taken a finance class, the difference between probabilistic risk and sort of more fundamental uncertainties. Risk is when you're rolling you're rolling dice. You don't know if number 1 through 6 is going to come up, but there's 6 numbers. And if it's a normal die, the probability of any one number coming up is 1/6. It's a very well understood problem. We can formalize it with mathematics. We can calculate expected returns and so forth. But there are other situations where we don't know the future, but we cannot characterize the problem in that sort of mathematical probabilistic way. What Frank Knight called true uncertainty or deep uncertainty. I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't have any probabilities to assign. I can't even conceive of the range of possible outcomes. So how do people act under those conditions? Well, Knight and Mises argued that, people still do make decisions about what to do in the uncertain future, but the way they understand the future is harder to pin down. It's more subjective and intuitive. We use words like, intuition, right? Or gut instinct, gut feeling. So according to these scholars, the entrepreneur is the actor who is willing to invest resources, to put money on the table, to have skin in the game in creating a company, running a company, building a product, reorganizing a firm or an industry, whatever, under conditions of fundamental uncertainty, what we now sometimes call Knightian uncertainty. And let me show you a quote from Mises. Mises says, both of these quotes are from his great treatise, Human Action, published in 1949. He says, the term entrepreneur, as used by economic theory, means acting man exclusively seen from the aspect of uncertainty inherent in every action. So, in a weird way, all of you acted entrepreneurially tonight. How so? Well, you showed up at this talk, right? Some of you students have a more material incentive for showing up at the talk, but some people, believe it or not, actually came just of their own free will, right? And is there a cost to coming here? Well, they weren't taking tickets at the door, right? There's not a dollar cost, but economics students, how do economists think about cost even when you're not paying in dollars? What do we call it? Opportunity cost, yeah. There are other things you could have done during this hour. You could have watched a movie on Netflix, you could have done your homework, you could have hung out with your friends. There's any number of things you could have done. The reason that you came is because you expected the benefits that you would receive in terms of knowledge and enlightenment and entertainment or extra credit or whatever would exceed the opportunity cost. The value of the benefits would exceed the value of that opportunity cost. Now, I am confident that all of you, when our event is over tonight, are going to go home. You're going to walk out of here singing and dancing. You may have tears streaming down your cheeks because you've never had an experience as good as the one you're having tonight, and you'll think, thank goodness I went to the lecture instead of watching that movie or watching episode 6 of The Last of Us or whatever it is you were going to do, because oh my gosh, that was the greatest experience of my life. So you would have achieved a benefit greater than the opportunity cost. But the point is, you didn't know that when you came. You didn't know that for sure. You had an idea. Maybe some of you came to the previous lecture in this series by my friend Bob Lawson, but of course that would give you put your expectations way too low. But you've been to other lectures like this, or you really need the extra credit or whatever. It's not that you were totally blind, but you didn't have an ironclad guarantee. And of course, it is theoretically possible, I know this won't happen, but it's theoretically possible that a person could walk out of here saying, oh my gosh, what a waste. I could barely stay awake. Watching paint dry would have been more entertaining than that. And you would have earned an economic loss compared to the other group that earned an economic profit. It's not dollar profit and loss. It's subjective profit and loss that exists only in your mind. But you chose to come in pursuit of profit and a desire to avoid loss. If you're right, if your expectations about the quality of the event compared to the opportunity cost are correct, then you're successful. Otherwise, you're unsuccessful. That's exactly what entrepreneurs do, but with investments of actual physical resources, dollars, economic value. They purchase factors of production and they combine them in an attempt to produce goods and services they can sell for more than what they paid. And they do that without an ironclad guarantee about the future revenues. If revenues exceed costs, you won, you earned a profit. Otherwise, you earn a loss. Under uncertainty, according to Mises, that's what entrepreneurs do. But notice the implication. Mises says, for this reason, it is impossible to eliminate the entrepreneur from the picture of a market economy. You cannot conceive of a market economy without entrepreneurs. Why? The various complementary factors of production, land, labor, raw materials, capital, IP, whatever, these factors of production cannot come together spontaneously. An iPhone doesn't just appear, it doesn't just spring from the ground or fall from a tree, right? These factors need to be combined by the purposive efforts of men. Sorry, ladies, this was written in the 1940s, of men aiming at certain ends and motivated by the urge to improve their state of satisfaction. In eliminating the entrepreneur, one eliminates the driving force of the whole market system. So this continual action, not just by entrepreneurs like in my example of us coming to a lecture, but specialized commercial entrepreneurs who are acquiring and combining factors of production in an attempt to earn profits and avoid losses. That's how we got an iPhone. That's how this building got built. That's what drives economic activity in a market system. If there were no uncertainty, therefore, then there would be no need for entrepreneurship because we would all know what's going to happen tomorrow. We could just kick back and just let it happen, right? But in the real world of uncertainty, the entrepreneur is the agent who drives the market forward. That has some important implications, right? Why does this matter? Well, it matters for economic growth, for improvements in societal well-being, right? Given this idea of entrepreneurs as the agents who organize production under conditions of uncertainty, successful entrepreneurship is what moves our society forward. Okay, sorry. By the way, notice that I'm describing entrepreneurship here in quite general terms. Entrepreneurship is this act of exercising what Knight and Mises called judgment, putting your own judgment on the line under conditions of uncertainty. It doesn't only happen in the context of small business. Some policymakers think, oh, well, gosh, if entrepreneurship is such a big deal, we need to have government subsidies and we need to alter the tax code and whatever to get more businesses of a certain type We need more small companies, fewer big companies. We need more tech companies, fewer potato companies, or whatever. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm saying we need an environment in which entrepreneurial experimentation can take place, in which entrepreneurs are free to give it a shot, to put their judgments about the uncertain future to the test, and whatever results from that, whatever proportion of large businesses to small, or startups to old companies, or tech companies to non-tech, whatever, that's what we should have, right? We shouldn't try to socially engineer a particular type of businesses, or particular ratio of different types of businesses ex ante. For that reason, government policies that target specific firms, specific individuals, specific technologies are unlikely to generate economy-wide benefits. If I can get the taxpayers to subsidize what I do, well, that's good for me. I'm all for it in that sense, right? But it doesn't mean it's good for society as a whole, right? Should Congress be giving subsidies for green energy, or for electric cars more narrowly, or for the next this or the next that, which we think will be a big breakthrough? That sort of old-fashioned 1950s, 60s, 70s style industrial policy, which was practiced in places like Japan and the Asian tigers to some degree, was popular in the US but with less success in the 60s, whatever, and sort of fell away, but unfortunately has been making a little bit of a comeback in the last 5 years or so. I think there are lots of reasons why we think those policies are not likely to work. Okay. So entrepreneurship in the functional sense, right? A function like exercising judgment under uncertainty, or for that matter, the function of alertness or the function of innovativeness, it works best. This function is exercised best and will tend to generate benefits in an environment with high levels of economic freedom. Okay, as I say, where this sort of experimental process can take place. It's not just public policy, it could apply to culture as well. Some people, so anthropologists and others who've studied different cultures have said, well, there are some places where sort of there's less tolerance for trying something new and being unsuccessful, right? Shame cultures, or, well, who did you think you are that you could do this new thing instead of doing what, your father did before you and your grandfather before him and so forth. So if there were ways to encourage people to experiment with new ideas, new businesses, new activities, and to be okay with the fact that a lot of them will not succeed, right? I mean, then that along with good public policy, along with economic freedom, we think would contribute to more and better kinds of entrepreneurship. Okay, but I promised to talk not only about entrepreneurs, but also about managers. Managers have a little bit of a bad rap, right? In the popular media, I should have had like a Michael Scott picture up here, right? Management is, it's often seen as something that sort of holds the entrepreneur back rather than, stimulates or encourages creativity on the part of entrepreneurs. Think of the kind of office in like an old movie. You guys ever seen an old movie from the 1950s, or even more recently, something like Mad Men? How many of you guys watched Mad Men? I mean, so it was a popular show because of the cool outfits and cars and all that, but it also depicted an office culture that was common in the 19th and early 20th century. It's fitting that I have a black and white image because it feels very black and white. A big office with all these desks that are exactly the same, and all the workers are doing the same job and wearing the same clothes, and they have very narrowly defined responsibilities. It's dull and boring. They're not getting to exercise their creativity, right? Who would want to work in an office like this, like that, if you could instead work in an office like this, right? In my newest book, we draw a contrast between, you guys seen The Social Network? Right, so think about it, what you think of the atmosphere of a tech startup. First of course, everybody's wearing jeans and t-shirts or whatever. And it's kind of loosey-goosey, and you've got beanbag chairs and a nice coffee machine, and there's not a whole lot of structure to it. That sounds fun. Whereas working in a 1950s style office sounds terrible. Okay, so, I think partly as a result of this idea we have that more fluid, loosely organized structures work better than more rigid ones. A lot of writers and scholars and consultants and teachers and so forth are promoting the idea that we ought to encourage most or even all companies to adopt a much flatter and looser kind of structure. And they often point to certain well-known and some less well-known companies like these. Like a lot of students probably are familiar with Valve and its Steam platform for video game distribution. Valve is very well known among academics in business schools. I don't know how many Harvard Business Review articles and similar types of things have been written about Valve, because Valve has a famously flat organizational structure. In fact, there's a handbook for new employees that you get on your first day at Valve that is called Welcome to Flatland. And, oh shoot, I keep hitting the wrong button. And Flatland is the term they use for the environment at Valve, meaning, you decide what projects you're going to work on, you decide who your teammates are going to be, you're free to talk to anybody or not. There's not, very little structure will be imposed from the top. In the agricultural sector, this is a company that you may not have heard of, but what's the name of the company here in Boise that is here in Idaho that's the world's largest potato company? Yeah, this is the same thing for tomatoes. There's a California tomato company called Morningstar, which is, I think, the largest US producer of tomatoes and tomato paste and tomato puree and so forth. But it's also very well known for having a radically egalitarian and flat organizational structure. Everybody who works at Morningstar is kind of an independent contractor. All your relationships with other people in the company are negotiated on a contract by contract basis. And this model has been widely described. Zappos, the online retailer that's now a subsidiary of Amazon, a shoe retailer, also has a very radically flat organizational structure. Haier, which is now one of the world's largest makers of appliances, it's a Chinese company that makes dishwashers and washing machines, among many other things, has a famously flat organizational structure too. This is the CEO, his name is Zhang Rumin of Haier. And they embrace a particular organizational model in English, Rendan Hei, which is a Chinese term that describes this unique organizational model. But listen to how he describes it. He says, with this model, we move away from being like an empire with a traditional closed pyramid to be more like a rainforest with an open networked platform. Every empire will eventually collapse. A rainforest, on the other hand, can be sustained. I don't know exactly what it means either, but it sounds good, right? I mean, wouldn't you rather work in a rainforest, right, than a traditional, tightly structured pyramid? This sounds more fluid, it sounds more dynamic, it sounds more engaging, but this gives you a flavor for the kind of language that is often used in the literature that promotes these kinds of organizations. There's a group of management thinkers have developed and described a model that they call holocracy. I don't know if you've heard of this before. Zappos, the shoe retailer that I mentioned before, embraced holocracy for a while. Then they switched back to a traditional model. Holocracy is a system of organizing people within a company or another kind of organization, where instead of the traditional pyramid with upper management and middle management and the workforce and so forth, where decisions are made at the top and then they go down, in the layers. And if you're in the traditional model, if you're, at the bottom, you want to change, you want to make a change, you want to suggest something new, you have to get permission from your supervisor, who has to get permission from their supervisor, and so forth, on up the line. Holocracy organizes people into these sort of semi-fluid groups called circles, right? And circles combine and recombine and dissolve with other circles. And there's this sort of constant movement of people in and out of different specialized groups groups designed to solve a particular task with no hierarchy of one group being higher than another. If anybody here has an IT background, in software development, it's very, people commonly use a model that is called Agile. Agile is a set of techniques for software development. It's kind of like a lean model. You do smaller units in more frequent intervals. And it's very much like the sort of flat hierarchy model as applies to software development. Another company that you all are familiar with that allegedly has a radical organizational model is Spotify. Spotify is a Swedish company, right? Tech company, which most of you probably stream your music on Spotify. But Spotify is famous for organizing people into what they call squads. So, whether engineers, project managers, people in sales, so forth, working on a specific project are organized into a squad. And then squads can be combined into tribes. And then a chapter is a group of people within a tribe, but in different squads who perform the same function, right? Squads can also be combined into what they call trios. Trios can then form alliances, and guilds can emerge within alliances. And this sounds really avant-garde. Okay, it turns out this is really just the sort of conventional matrix structure, but with a fancy name. Why am I telling you all this? Because as Professor Dalton indicated, I just published a book in October of 2022 called Why Managers Matter: The Perils of the Bossless Company, which is an analysis and critique of what my co-author Nikolai Foss and I call the bossless company narrative. The bossless company narrative is the idea that every company, or almost every company, should be, if not literally bossless, at least as flat as possible. Get rid of the hierarchy, flatten the hierarchy, eliminate unnecessary layers of middle management, make things as fluid and organic as you can. That will lead to higher profits, higher performance, growth, longevity, and so forth. We think this argument is not correct. We think there are a few examples of companies with radically flat structures, not really bossless as it turns out, that have performed well. But in general, this is not a model that works for most companies in most circumstances. I should mention the other two books that I showed you before are books that you should definitely read, no doubt about it, but they're more kind of academic books. A professor might assign it as assigned reading in a college class, and other professors will read them and so forth. This book is meant as a book you could give to your grandma. Okay, this is meant, you walk into Barnes & Noble, you're just browsing the business section, and there it is. So what I'm saying is this is a book that is designed to earn the authors truckloads of money. Okay, so far that hasn't happened, but I do have this dream, this sort of fantasy that like I'm on an airplane and there's somebody next to me reading this yellow book, and I look over and it's my book. And I'm like, oh, so how do you like it? What do you think of that book? And oh, it's pretty good, And we strike up a conversation, and then the person's like, and it's like, did you guys see that viral meme from the other day with some little girl sitting down at courtside at some basketball game, and LeBron James sits down next to her, and she has like a panic attack because she can't believe. That's the experience I want when the person next to me on the airplane realizes I'm the author of this book. Okay, any day now. Could happen on my flight back to Texas tomorrow. Okay, wait a minute. Some of you are saying, I thought this was the Spriggs Lecture in Free Enterprise on free markets, and I thought they were bringing in free market speakers and people influenced by thinkers like Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian School of Economics. And didn't Mises, on the right, and his younger colleague Friedrich Hayek teach that bottom-up organization is better than top-down? Mises and Hayek famously critiqued central economic planning, socialist-style economic planning, as being ineffective, impossible according to Mises, because the people at the top of the pyramid cannot possibly have the right information to make good decisions throughout the economy. And Mises' argument is slightly different from that. But they're famous for arguing that free markets are better than central planning. It sounds like you, professor, are arguing for central planning in the form of the traditional managerial hierarchy. And don't we believe in general that bottom up beats top down? Isn't that the lesson of thinkers like Mises and Hayek? Don't we know that Wikipedia is better than the Encyclopedia Britannica? Okay, students, your professors will not say that, but I'm going to say it because I'm from out of town. Your professors will say, oh, you can't use Wikipedia as one of your sources. Okay, you don't have to cite it, but Wikipedia is actually pretty good. It's just as good as the Encyclopedia Britannica on average in terms of accuracy and quality. Yeah, I mean, of course there are mistakes in Wikipedia, but there are mistakes in the traditional encyclopedia too. And I forgot to look up the number, but Wikipedia has, millions and millions of entries on all kinds of topics, whereas the Britannica, has a very small set. But it's a totally different model, right? Britannica is a top-down model. There's an editor-in-chief who commissions editors of the different volumes in different topic areas, and they get authors who write chapters, who submit the chapters, and they get reviewed and edited, blah, 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 blah. It's a hierarchy. Traditional hierarchical production model. Whereas Wikipedia, right, who decides what will be written about in Wikipedia? Anybody, yeah, anybody can write an article. Anybody can edit an article. It's a totally spontaneous, bottom-up kind of a model. Gosh, are you saying that the Encyclopedia Britannica is better than Wikipedia? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is this. Or rather, what our book says is the following. We challenge this narrative that within private companies, I'm not talking about the US economy or the old Soviet Union, within private companies, it's not the case that flattening the hierarchy is always better, right? We argue that in the modern economy, the knowledge-based economy, et cetera, well-exercised managerial authority is even more important than it used to be, not less important, despite what you might think from studying Valve or Zappos or something like that. And in the book, the more academic part of the book, we do have some meaty stuff towards the back where we explain sort of the theory of hierarchy, what hierarchy is and does, what are the different types of hierarchy. And we try to provide some practical advice to managers on how to make their organizations work better. Let me give you just a little bit more detail on a few points, and then we'll be ready to have some questions. One of our arguments is that this model of the bossless company or the near bossless company is not something new. It's not specific to the tech sector. It's very old. I mean, some of you may remember from your history books the cooperative movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, where the idea was that the workers can own the business themselves, or maybe the customers, or maybe the suppliers. And we have a lot of evidence that in general the cooperative model is not as effective as the investor-owned model of the company, for reasons that I'll explain in just a moment. But we have lots of experience with bossless companies, and they generally have not worked very well. Part of the reason why cooperatives generally don't work well, one reason it comes from a book by the great legal theorist Henry Hansman at Yale University. He wrote a book called The Ownership of Enterprise, where he analyzes different ownership forms, proprietorships, partnerships, publicly traded companies, cooperatives, and so forth. And he points out that each of these different ownership and governance models has pros and cons. Right? They have some features that work well in some circumstances, features that work less well in others. And one of the points he makes is that, surprisingly, sometimes it works better if those who own the organization and have to make the tough decisions about how the organization is going to be run have no other relationship with the organization besides that. And you think, well, wait a minute, wouldn't it be better if the workers own the company? Because then it's like their own company, right? And they'll work hard, they'll try to do what's best for the company because they identify with the company. Kind of like, one example would be a family business. Some of you may come from a family business background. Okay, it's not just a business, it's also our family name. And it's a way of providing good jobs to all of my cousins and so forth. Huntsman argues that that model actually, in many cases, works less well because it's hard to make tough decisions about what to do with the assets you own when it's also the place you work. And it also has your name on it. And you have all these this complex set of relationships, right? If I'm a worker in a worker-owned cooperative and I don't like, the direction the company is going, I disagree with my fellow owners or the board or whatever, and I think we should go in a different direction, I want out. Well, the only way I can get out is to quit my job. And now I'm unemployed. I've got to find a job somewhere else. Whereas if I'm a stockholder and I'm an equity holder in a company and I disagree with my fellow owners or I don't like the CEO or whatever, to exit, all I have to do is sell my equity. If it's a publicly traded company, I can exit in 2 or 3 mouse clicks on E-Trade. I just sell my shares, I'm out. No harm, no foul. I can invest in something else. That can actually lead to less conflict among owners than when the owners are also the people who work there, also the people who shop there or whatever. There's also, kind of the Homer Simpson problem, right? That not everybody wants the responsibility and, dare I say, the pressure and stress of being the ultimate decision maker or being part of the ownership group. Did any of you come from your parents run a small business? It's like, who's lying awake at night wondering if they're going to make payroll that week? If I'm an employee, I don't want to lose my job, right? But it's not my responsibility to make sure the company runs. I don't have to make all those decisions. And I may not want to make all those decisions. Let me actually use myself, Peter Klein, as an example. I study entrepreneurship. I write about entrepreneurship. I teach entrepreneurship. But I personally am a bureaucrat. Right? I'm a professor. I'm a tenured professor at Baylor University. I get a salary. And you guys know what tenure is, right? It's like I can never be fired, almost. Right? So I could not even show up for work, and maybe I would get fired. But people say, well, why don't you use your entrepreneurial knowledge to become the next Elon Musk yourself? I don't want to do that. Okay? I don't want the stress and anxiety of being responsible for my own livelihood and making payroll and all that. I prefer to be a salaried professor and I get a paycheck every month. I'd like it to be bigger, but I get a paycheck every month, and if I sell books on the side, that's just like a side hustle. Not everybody wants to be the owner or the boss. Not everybody wants to be your own boss. Oh yeah, I want autonomy. I want a workplace where I'm in charge of what I do during the day. Are you sure you want that? Some people want that, and that's great. Some people don't. Some people would rather have well-defined, more routine activities, and then they have a different work-life balance. And maybe they find meaning outside of work rather than in work. My point is there's nothing wrong with that. We don't need one kind of model for every type of employee or worker. Another problem with the bossless company narrative is that those examples that I just showed you are totally cherry-picked. It's not like a systematic study of the impact of flatness on profitability. It's like, here are a few companies that seem to be pretty cool and have flat structures. Well, boy, everybody should have a flat structure. No, that's not the way you do scientific research. And it's also the case that these companies, I call them the poster children for the bossless company narrative. If you look more closely, a lot of them either failed or abandoned their experiment with the flat hierarchy and went back to the pyramid. Zappos is an example. It tried holocracy for a while. Holocracy didn't work well, and they went back to a more conventional kind of managerial structure. There are a few sort of institutions that have emerged and survived and done well with a bottom-up structure, like Wikipedia is an example. I'll say more about that in a second. Some of you may have studied in your econ classes, the emergence of the common law, or the emergence of common language as an example of spontaneous order, bottom-up, undirected order. but it doesn't follow that that's a sound way to manage an organization. Okay, I don't want, we're getting towards the end of our time here, but who doesn't want some theory, right, to wake you right up if you've sort of dozed off for a minute? No, I mean, the theory that illuminates our argument is quite simple, right? And it's a theory that everybody knows already. We didn't invent it. It's that, decentralization in any context has not only benefits, but also costs. Okay, what are some of the benefits? As Hayek taught us, decentralization makes better use of dispersed tacit knowledge. The people at the bottom of the structure know more about what's going on the ground than the people at the top of the pyramid. By delegating decision authority to people at the bottom, you can allow them to use that tacit knowledge and make sound decisions. I did it again. Strong incentives, right? In a decentralized organization with performance-based incentives, people are strongly motivated to do well. However, there are also what economists call the principal agent problem, agency problems, and coordination problems. Sometimes the pieces the different parts of a production process have to coordinate well with each other. Let me give an example for the students. Okay, you guys have a major, right? And so you have to take a sequence of courses to get the major, right? And there's prereqs. Some courses have a prereq, right? Have you ever been in a class, like an intermediate class, and the professor's doing something, and the professor's like, oh, well, to be able to solve this homework problem, you need to know XYZ theory, but you already got that in the prereq, so I'm not going to cover it today. Now let me move on to the next topic. And you're all thinking, we didn't get that in our other class, right? We've never seen that before. We actually have no idea what you're talking about. And then you can't understand the rest of the class because that professor thought in the prereq they were doing something that they're actually not doing. Have you ever had that experience? Or what about the professor spends an hour going over something that you've already seen 3 times in 3 other classes? That's a coordination problem, right? Because at universities, you know how professors are. Professors don't like to be told what to do. They want to teach what they want to teach and how they want to teach. And it's assumed somehow that all the different courses will fit together into a major or a minor or whatever. But sometimes they don't, because one piece of the puzzle doesn't fit another piece. That's an example of coordination failure. Think about Henry Ford's assembly line. You've got the chassis over here, and then they move down the line, and then somebody drops the engine into the chassis, and moves down the line. Somebody puts the wheels on the, puts the body on the car, and so forth. All those pieces have to fit. They have to be the right size and shape. All the little connectors, the holes have to be in the right place. If you've ever tried to assemble furniture from IKEA or Walmart and the holes aren't drilled in the right place, you know the level of frustration that discoordination can cause. They have to come at the right speed. You don't want a backlog at this station or a pile up at this station. So if you allowed every professor to have complete autonomy over what they do in their classes, the classes wouldn't fit together into a major or a degree. Okay? If you allow every worker on the assembly line to have full autonomy in how they run their station, the different parts of the assembly line, the different stages won't fit together, and you can't make cars. Okay, that's an example of a coordination problem that sometimes managerial authority can solve. One more little piece of theory, and then that'll be my last piece of theory, I promise. Another famous scholar that you may have heard about or may not have is an economist named Herbert Simon. And he won the Nobel Prize in economics, but he also made contributions in computer science and psychology. He's a really interesting thinker. And he wrote several landmark studies on the nature of authority. And Simon, in his works, distinguished between 2 types, which in the book we call type 1 and type 2 authority. Okay, not very creative. Type 1 authority is what we often conventionally think authority is. The boss commands the worker to perform a specific task. command and control. Right? When you're a little kid, your mom gets you dressed in the morning, or your mom gets out your clothes and you put on those clothes and get ready, get your backpack on, get ready for school, we're leaving now. Command and control. That's what we often think authority is. But Simon points out that authority can also take the form not of telling people what to do, but of designing systems and structures and processes or rules, what you might call the rules of the game, within which people can make their own decisions. Okay? As you get older, as a teenager and a college student, your mom's not picking out your clothes, at least I hope. Right? But there are certain rules from your school, from your family, whatever. You have a structure within which you can make a lot of your own decisions. And a surprising example of this is, to go back to an example from before, Wikipedia. You might say, gosh, Wikipedia seems like the ultimate bossless company, and doesn't it disprove your arguments, Professor? Well, it turns out Wikipedia is not a bossless organization. Wikipedia actually has a boss. His name is Jimmy Wales. Okay, who is Jimmy Wales? Well, that's his Wikipedia page, of course. Jimmy Wales is the creator of Wikipedia. He was the leader of the team that wrote the code to create the Wikipedia, engine or whatever. So all the code that runs the formatting and the organization and the way people communicate in Wikipedia, that code was written by Jimmy Wales and his team. Jimmy Wales actually was a student of my friend Mark Thornton at Auburn University, and they read an article by Hayek on the failure of socialism, and Jimmy Wales was inspired to create an open source, free online encyclopedia that anyone could edit to try to put Hayek's model to good use. Now, what do I mean when I say he's the boss of Wikipedia? Okay, look, one of the things that we like about Wikipedia compared to other online resources, I think most of us like it for this reason, it's like real neat and it's nicely structured. All the articles are formatted the same way, right? It's easy to navigate and find the information you want. If you, I don't have a laser on here. If you like to edit Wikipedia entries, you can click on the little, well, on this one you can't, but on most articles you can click on a little edit tab. And if you want to argue with people and get in a flame war over revising the Wikipedia article, you can do that. And it tracks your IP address and all that. Some of you know what I'm talking about. All that structure was designed by Jimmy Wales and his team. So what do I mean by calling him the boss of Wikipedia? Does that mean that Jimmy Wales wrote all the articles on Wikipedia? No. Jimmy Wales did not create the content of Wikipedia articles. What he did was design a system within which people could create and edit Wikipedia articles. He designed the rules of the game and then allowed people to play. That's a kind of authority. That is one form of authority. It's not command and control, but it's also extremely important. And maybe this is the kind of authority that is more relevant for us today. There's also a dispute resolution aspect. I mean, I have some managerial responsibility in my job as a department chair. Kind of what it is on most days, on many days, is like being a marriage counselor. Student, professor, two students, two professors are in a big fight, and they come into my office and they tell me their story, and I have to come up with a solution to get them, to be okay with each other. I mean, so you can design a system, but then when something breaks down and there's a conflict, somebody's got to intervene and solve that problem. That's also what managers do. Okay, so just to summarize what I said a second ago, when does flatness work? Under what circumstances do flat hierarchies perform reasonably well? When you have a simple technology, I don't mean simple like, unimportant, but like producing tomatoes. It's a well understood technology. Not a lot of uncertainty about the future, and low interdependence, few interdependencies across tasks and jobs and subunits. That's like in my assembly line, auto assembly line example, there's high interdependency. The success of each stage depends on the other stages. In your undergraduate courses, there's a moderate level of interdependency. It's not that high, but there's some, so the courses fit together, right? At Valve, right, you had groups of designers writing software code for specific projects that had nothing to do with any of the other projects on the platform. So you had a very low level of interdependence in that case, and that's why the model worked reasonably well. Yeah, so again, what we're seeing in our world today is more of this type 2 authority and less of the type 1 authority. So really what good management is, it's not telling people what to do, it's designing organizations. Organizational design is probably the central management task of the 21st century. Okay, other stuff we talk about in the book includes the history of hierarchy in companies and in other settings. We talk about the ethics of hierarchy. Is it morally wrong to have authority over other people? We talk about how hierarchy can sometimes promote innovation. And unfortunately, we don't have copies for you to purchase tonight, but if you go to your favorite retailer, online or physical, you can certainly find a copy to buy. So thank you very much for coming out tonight, and I think we have time for some questions and discussion.
Okay, where are my students with the, okay, there's one, there's another one. If you have questions, raise your hand and we'll go from there. Nope, what?
I think
All right, there we go. Wouldn't better organizational design lead to flatter hierarchies, as you need fewer and fewer actual people in the hierarchy because the structure takes care of that?
Right, so the question is, can you hear? The question was, you know, would skilled management, would a well-designed organization tend to be flatter or to become flatter over time? I think the answer is not necessarily, right? Because again, a well-designed auto assembly line does not, the fact that it's well-designed doesn't reduce the amount of interdependence. It just means you need some middle management or senior management to make sure, you know, that as circumstances change, right? As car designs change, as technology changes, as consumer preferences changes, that you have someone making sure that the different steps fit together. So a well-designed organization might be quite hierarchical. And of course, that optimal design can change. It can change over time with changes in technology and the environment and so forth. But I think it's not the case that a better designed organization will almost always be flatter. It may be that you just need those middle layers because of the nature of the task, the nature of the job, nature of the technology, or whatever. In the front?
What do you think is going to happen as interest rates rise with flatter organizations?
Yes, the question is, you know, will rising interest rates affect organizational structure? I mean, we would certainly expect them to affect the capital structure of the firm, right? Debt is becoming a less attractive mode of finance than equity. And as you know, debt and equity are not just alternative ways of getting money. There's also, you know, governance and managerial implications as well, because equity holders have certain decision rights that debt holders typically don't. So if we see a shift away from debt towards equity, then we would expect to see more opportunities for, you know, active management on the part of those equity holders. Does that mean that they would prefer a flatter or a more hierarchical organization? I don't think that's something that we can say for sure. But you know, the problem with rising interest rates is it's not that interest rates are going up. It's that for so long, you know, certainly since 2008, interest rates have been so artificially low that the structure of the economy is not the one that would have emerged under more sort of, you know, free market conditions. So this heavily, you know, government-directed suppression of interest rates has led to an organization of the economy that's different from the one that otherwise would have obtained. And if interest rates rise to what, to something closer to what we would expect the sort of natural rate or free market rate to have been anyway, well, I mean, it's probably better if interest rates are more connected to people's, time preferences rather than being artificially low. But that transition from low to normal can be quite painful and involve a lot of readjustments as well.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on information technology being able to kind of reduce the friction between various entities, and more specifically, kind of in the last couple of months with things like OpenAI and things like that? What do you think the impact will be in terms of organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it is often thought that better information technology eliminates some of those middle management layers because, senior executives, now they have all these dashboards. They can monitor everything that's going on in the organization without having to go through different subordinates. Maybe AI can help us to organize information in a way that the right information can get to the decision maker quickly, more efficiently, better decision making. I mean, that's all. Some of that is happening to some degree, but there's a catch. So I actually participated in a study with some European colleagues on how the adoption of better IT, managerial IT for managing employees, how that has changed what executives do. And what we found is that there is some evidence for more direct connection between senior executives and lower level employees. So some reduction in middle management layers, but ironically, that led to an increase in sort of heavy-handed micromanagement on the part of senior executives. So there's an example that I use, we talk about it in the book. A few years ago, an email was leaked, I guess. It was an email from Elon Musk to Tesla employees where he was touting the sort of radical, democratized model that he claimed was at Tesla. He said at Tesla, anybody in the organization can talk to anybody else. You don't need permission. You don't have to go through a buffer. In principle, even you could contact anybody with one phone call or one email, even me. And even the lowest level employee at Tesla is only one phone call away from the boss. Well, that sounds great if I'm a lower level employee and I want my concern to be heard. But remember, that also means that Elon Musk is only one phone call away from me. And that may not sound so good. I don't really want Elon Musk showing up, at my door. Our dean is in the room. I appreciate that I can, contact my dean when I have an issue or a problem, but I really don't want him showing up at my class and looking in the window and seeing what I'm doing. That would make me very nervous. The point is that, middle management can serve a valuable kind of buffering function in both directions, right? It may be that, Elon, it's really not efficient for Elon to hear every single thought of every employee. Somebody needs to filter out the ones that are most relevant for the decisions he has to make. And vice versa. I would prefer to have a few layers to cushion the blow before, the edict from Elon comes down. So what IT has done in leading to some streamlining of that structure, it has both pros and cons. Executives report that they're kind of intervening more than they used to, and some employees report decreased employee satisfaction from the fact that the boss is so, is metaphorically peering over my shoulder. A related question is, can OpenAI, can ChatGPT manage? Or can GPT manage, right? Can an AI manage? Or can AI be entrepreneurial? I mean, so far, I'm not a computer scientist, but my understanding of the literature is that we're pretty far away from that. We're quite far away from, despite what you've seen in Terminator movies or whatever, from AI having sentience and being able to make independent decisions. Our notion of entrepreneurial judgment is like, you're sort of ultimately responsible for making those decisions. You can't pass the decision. You can't pass the buck to somebody else. You probably heard it was President Truman supposedly had a sign on his desk that says the buck stops here. That's where that expression comes from. It means you can't pass the buck to anybody else. The decision stops with you. AI is not capable of doing that because AI has a designer. I mean, a designer can task AI with doing certain things, but an AI cannot assign itself its own tasks, at least yet. I mean, maybe in the future it will be possible to do that. But I'm kind of, not a skeptic exactly, but I think it's great that we have these new tools, but I don't think they fundamentally change the nature of ownership, entrepreneurship, or management as much as it would appear from some of the hype.
So, sorry, you had mentioned that there were certain demographics that were less likely to kind of launch into entrepreneurship due to like the inability to absorb like a failure or shame, but we also hear about certain entrepreneurs that rose from poverty. Do you think that they are outliers, or do you think that there's like a correlation between poverty and like entrepreneurship?
Oh yeah, it's a great question. So I mean, there are many successful entrepreneurs, just like successful people in all walks of life, in science, in art, in music, whatever, who, you know, were sort of driven to excel, to overcome some disadvantages. And I, you know, again, this is not my area of expertise, but you know, there are pros and cons to having a privileged background. Yes, you have access to the best schools and networks and all that, but you also might not have been forced to overcome obstacles the way that others did. I mean, there is a lot of literature on, you know, what they call serial entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs who start one business, exit, start another business, exit, or start a business, bankruptcy, start another business, fail, start another business, right? And there's a lot of evidence that learning from failure in entrepreneurship, like in other walks of life, right, has advantages not only in helping you think more clearly, but in sort of building resilience, the ability to get past those sorts of problems. So yeah, I'm clearly not saying that successful entrepreneurs do or do not emerge from less advantaged backgrounds. Really what I was thinking about more is sort of a cultural thing. And I mean, I don't want to say anything that's, you know, politically insensitive or whatever, but at one previous university where I taught, we had a lot of students at our university who were from rural areas, from small towns. We also had some from big cities, right? But some of the kids from small towns would tell me, you know, all this entrepreneurship stuff sounds great, but where I'm from, you know, I'm expected to do these certain things. If I go out and try to start a technology company and it fails, as most of them do, then when I go back home, I will be shamed, right? The general attitude in the town will be, well, who did you think you were that you could rise above, you know, you thought you were better than us? It can also be a national culture thing. There's what they call, in some countries they call it the tall poppy syndrome. Have you ever heard of that? You know, a poppy is a flower that grows in a field. And the idea is the poppies that are taller than all the other poppies get chopped off. So, you know, in some cultures, it's not cool to try to excel beyond kind of the average. They often, for example, the Scandinavian cultures are very egalitarian, and that sort of tall poppy problem is often talked about there. But yet again, those are very successful economies with a lot of great entrepreneurs. I discovered I was giving a talk like this in Latin America one time, and they said, oh yeah, in our country, it's not tall poppy. We have an expression, it's something about the crabs. Like if you have a bucket of crabs, the crabs that try to crawl out fastest, I don't know, will get pushed back down, or I can't remember exactly how the metaphor works, I've forgotten. But almost all cultures have something like that. So, you know, it may be that kind of attitude is not conducive to as much experimentation. I mean, part of the problem with that is, suppose you think that's true. Well, I mean, how do you change a culture? That's not really something that we can have a big impact on overnight. You know, people like me can write books or whatever. It's not going to change anything in the short term or maybe ever. Whereas, you know, if there's like a government subsidy or a part of the tax code that we think is impeding entrepreneurship, you know, in principle, that's something that you could flip a switch and make that a lot better. You could have more of an impact right away. So I think, yeah, right here.
First of all, thank you very much for your time and welcome to Idaho.
Thank you.
So I was curious about the recent kind of tech layoffs. I recently read an article by Business Insider titled Tech CEOs Screwed Up and Now Laid Off Employees Are Paying the Price. Google's parent company Alphabet recently laid off 12,000 employees. I was wondering if kind of these tech CEOs or entrepreneurs, should they bear some kind of responsibility, or would that kind of impede experimentation and so on?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, as within any organization, I mean, yes, of course, CEOs bear responsibility, leadership bears responsibility for things that go wrong in an organization, whether that is in the form of layoffs or selling assets or products failing, bankruptcy, whatever. I mean, ultimately the buck stops with those decision makers who made errors that are now subsequently being, dealt with through things like layoffs, for sure. But I mean, part of the problem is there's different layers to this. I think there's some business cycle phenomena at play. So as this gentleman was asked about low interest rates, right? We've had sort of an artificial boom. One of the things that Mises and Hayek were also famous for is developing a business cycle theory about how ultra low interest rates stimulate sort of investment in the wrong things, more long-term projects, more capital-intensive projects that are ultimately not sustainable. But the point is, where the boom manifests, will it be in the housing sector? Will it be in construction? Will it be in agriculture? That the theory doesn't say. I mean, it depends on the specific historical context. But I think, look, there's been a tech boom, a couple of tech booms, but certainly a tech boom over the last decade or so. Some of that may be stimulated by artificially cheap credit and so forth. So layoffs to some extent may represent a correction from that. Some of it surely represents entrepreneurial error on the part of the top decision makers. They hired too many people relative to what market demand could accommodate. I mean, it's very tricky in software too. I mean, look at Twitter. Twitter's another interesting example. Twitter has laid off a large number of staff, but according to Elon, the small number of engineers and programmers they have left are the only ones they really ever needed in the first place. All the others were, the content moderation team and the FBI liaison team, right? All the people who are not writing code or making the product work, but were doing all kinds of, woke stuff. And so maybe even at companies like Google, it may be that some employees were not really contributing to the core product or suite of products, and maybe management thinks, oh, well, gosh, you can actually produce goods and services that people want to use without so many employees. You get rid of the ones that really weren't adding value, and maybe that leads to some streamlining or layoffs. But I mean, obviously it depends. Every case is different, every company is different. But yes, in general, large, massive layoffs or selling assets or bankruptcy typically indicates that there was some error made on the entrepreneur's part. But remember, we're talking about deep uncertainty. Should that error have been avoided? Would you or I have made a different decision in years past? Maybe not. I mean, sometimes we don't know that something was an error until it is revealed down the road, and we really couldn't have made a better decision anyway, given what we knew at the time.
Thank you again for being here. My question is, from a top-down, bottom-up corporate structure, is how does that play into generations? So for example, your photo up there, the black and white photo, I'm just going to classify that maybe to be the great generation, I'm not sure, or maybe just at the end of the great generation. And then there's the Gen Xers that are very individual. They are not interested in that sitting all in the same. We're the generation, so to speak, that's me, that likes to work from home by themselves. We're really comfortable that way. And then the generation right after us is, more the collaborative. They want to be together. So my big question is, how does the corporate structure that we see, how much of it really depends on the generation, and then where do we go from here going out?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I would answer it is I'd slightly generalize and say, a lot of these business trends, managerial, organizational trends, they also reflect broader societal and cultural trends. Look, a lot of this sort of, flatter, leaner, more autonomous, empowered employees, those models started to be put into practice and talked about in the 60s and 70s by hippies, right? It was the hippie era. No one, the 1950s, everybody was squares. They were squares. They wore a suit and confined and, traditional values and so forth. When people rebelled against that in the hippie era, these sort of flatter structures, it was like the hippie version of management. This is how the flower children would run an organization, right? And then as other cultural shifts have taken place, we see corporate strategy and behavior reflecting that as well. I mean, so what's going on right now, we hear a lot, especially about Gen Zs, and not only do, so they like a lot of autonomy, they like flexible hours, they want to find meaning in their work, they don't like rigid schedules, and they're not as ambitious in terms of, climbing the corporate ladder as maybe their parents or grandparents' generation. That's what they say is true of that sort of culture. Okay, if that's true, then employers who are seeking to hire Gen Z and maybe even some millennial employees, obviously you got to take worker preference into account, or nobody's going to want to work for you. And so an organizational design, that seems great from a theoretical perspective, but is unattractive to the kinds of workers you want to employ, well, that's not going to be a successful model either. So you kind of have to adapt to the times. But I will say, I think some of the discussion of the current generation, now those of you who are in that generation, you can tell me what you think. Some of it may be a little bit exaggerated. So have you heard of what they call quiet quitting? Quiet quitting is where you don't literally quit your job, you just kind of slack, you kind of slack. You don't really work that hard. You do the bare minimum necessary to get by. You don't hope for a promotion or whatever. You take the paycheck, but you don't go above and beyond the call. My boss wants me to work late, not doing that. Working weekends, not doing that. I'm hanging out with my friends. It may be the standard interpretation of quiet quitting is that that it's this sort of, this is what millennial and especially Gen Z workers want, and you can't get them to work hard, blah, 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 blah. But some of it may actually be, and we wrote an article on this, it may be connected to the flat hierarchy phenomenon. It may be that some workers are cutting back their commitments or quiet quitting because they don't want a job where they have to make all these difficult decisions all the time. Maybe they can find meaning outside of work. They want a job. They want to get paid. They don't want the job to be horribly dull or demeaning. But it isn't necessary to give them more and more responsibility and authority and autonomy and have them make decisions. That maybe that's what they're reacting against. So this flattening the hierarchy, making everyone their own boss, may be unattractive to younger workers, despite the conventional narrative that that's exactly what younger workers want. I think we don't know as much about that, overall as we think. There's also the corollary, or the newer version of quiet quitting is what they call rage applying. Have you heard of that? Rage applying is when you're so mad and frustrated with your job, you just start sending out resumes. You just start, you throw a bunch of stuff on LinkedIn, you apply for 100 jobs, and you might actually get one, like almost by accident, that's better than the job you have, and then you take it. So when I get sideways with the dean, I say, I might do a little bit of rage applying. I wonder if Boise State has any openings in my field.
Last question. Thank you again for coming out today. Really enjoyed your talk. At the beginning of it, you talked about how if you were to ask a question to someone at the World Bank about how to push growth in developing economies, they will respond with entrepreneurship. What sort of policies and environment needs to exist in order to encourage more entrepreneurship, and what could we do, if anything, in a developed economy to help spur entrepreneurship in developing economies?
Now, that's a great question. I think really what it comes down to is the role of institutions and policies that are conducive to entrepreneurial activity, like one that has been very widely discussed and is often used by the World Bank as a metric for kind of the quality of the business environment, are things like the number of days it takes to start a company. How many days? I wish I had a graph chart to show you, but because you got to get like a legally registered company. You've got to get a permit. You've got to do some paperwork. You've got to get a business license. In Hong Kong, it takes 24 hours to get a business license. In India, it takes 285 days. In Brazil, it takes 342 days. I mean, so there's different measures of like legal and regulatory obstacles. How long does it take on average to resolve a contract dispute? You're running a company. You've got a contract where you paid somebody to deliver materials to you they didn't deliver. So in a well-functioning legal system, you have the recourse to file a lawsuit, and the threat of you filing a lawsuit will typically prevent the supplier from trying to shaft you or whatever. Okay, what if you're in a society where the legal system is completely non-functional, or legal system doesn't work well, and enforcing property rights is very difficult? It takes years and years to resolve a contract dispute. Well, who's going to want to invest? Who's going to want to innovate in an environment where your contracting parties could take advantage of you and you have no recourse? So finding ways to make the business environment more friendly, which means free trade, a low tax environment, few regulatory or legal barriers to starting organizations, a well-functioning monetary and credit system. You can get loans. Now, what can we do from here in Boise, Idaho, to make that better in an emerging market? That's a trickier question. That's a political question, social and cultural question. I think we can export good practices, meaning that we embrace those good practices ourselves, which we don't necessarily do. We sort of lead by example. And also, there's sort of a market process at work here too, that there's an incentive for countries with poorly functioning institutions to try to make them better because they attract foreign investment. Right? We even see that in the United States at the U.S. state level. So U.S. states often compete for big manufacturing projects and so forth. Look at the automakers. So the historic home of the U.S. auto industry was Detroit. That's where the big four, big three, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler were headquartered. But if you look at the where are automobiles manufactured by foreign manufacturers in the U.S., Honda has a big plant in Ohio. BMW has its manufacturing plant in South Carolina. Mercedes in the U.S. are made in Alabama. It's not the traditional manufacturing states. And it's because those other states were perceived to have a more friendly business environment, lower taxes, lower restrictions. That makes it more attractive for firms to locate there, and politicians like that, more tax revenue for them, PR, whatever. I mean, even, you guys are experiencing this in Idaho, just like we are in Texas. All the Californians. Okay, no offense. We're happy for you to come here and spend your money. We don't like it when you bid up our house prices, but we also don't want you bringing your wacky California ideas to places like Texas and Idaho. Elon Musk moved Tesla's headquarters from Fremont, California, wherever it was, to Austin, Texas. A lot of tech firms are relocating out of California. Financial firms are relocating out of New York because it's so costly to do business there. So there's kind of a built-in pressure on different jurisdictions because they're competing with other jurisdictions for where mobile capital can go. Now that pressure is not strong enough to make policies good everywhere, but it does place some check on how bad we can expect those policies to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There will be a Adam Smith lecture a month from tomorrow in the Special Events Center. Watch for advertising on that. Thank you for coming tonight.
very convincing. That was up there. There was like 4 of us.